Okay, we're back with part two. This is my ongoing, I guess we could call it a series now, discussion on what I like to call the curious correlations between the occult and the evangelical church, or evangelicalism as a whole. I've been walking through history and kind of showing you various or discussing various movements within history, all that are leading up to, the point I'm trying to make. When we left off on the last video, I was discussing Cotton Mathers and his role, his involvement in the Salem witch trials, his own involvement with witchcraft or experiencing witchcraft in his town and community, uh, encountering some young women who were suffering from demonic oppression or demonization, but then his own angelic visions. And I wanted to pick up from there, and I actually am going to start by reading a passage from the Bible here. So if you have a Bible and want to follow along, feel free. This is Ezekiel chapter 31. Now, I'm going to actually go back and read the whole chapter. But before I do that, I want to read a portion of the chapter, because this portion of this chapter is the passages from the scriptures that these angelic beings quoted to Cotton Mathers, per his account. Okay, so this would be verses 3 essentially through 7. And it says this: Behold, the Assyrian was a cedar in Lebanon, with fair branches and with a shadowing shroud, and of a high stature, and his top was among the thick boughs. The water made him great, the deep set him up on high, with her rivers running around them about the plants, and sent out their little rivers out unto the trees of the field. Therefore his height was exalted above all the trees of the field, and his boughs were multiplied, and his branches became long because of the multitude of waters when he shot forth. All the fowls of the heavens made their nests in his boughs, and under his branches did all the beasts of the field bring forth their young, and under the shadows dwelt all the nations. Thus was he fair in his greatness, in his strength, and in his branches, for his root was by great waters. So this is the passage that this angel uh, quotes to Cotton Mathers in his first angelic vision. This is the passage that Mathers then takes in and interprets as a prophecy about his own future, that he's supposed to be like the cedars of Lebanon, standing high above all else, and that he's been tasked with this great responsibility. And this is when we get the information that he's gonna publish all these books and become this very prominent, important figure within Christianity. Again, which is true. Now, what's interesting about this, and I'm actually not going to read the whole chapter because it's quite long, but those particular verses are essentially, they sound, when they're isolated out of context, as though they're praising this person that it's speaking about. But when you actually read the entire passage and put it in context, this is a prophecy against the Pharaoh. And what it's actually saying is, essentially, it's targeting the Pharaoh. But we know, and you'll know if you've watched my other videos, that oftentimes the leaders of nations were working and colluding directly with principalities, right? Demonic pagan entities. And so they're working together. And this is a reference to the Pharaoh in power, or the king in power. They're using the terminology Pharaoh. But it's also a veiled reference to the pagan god that's in place over Assyria. And it's basically saying that, you stood high, you had all this power, you were given all this greatness, you stood above all things, you had a strong root system in the rivers, the beasts of the field lived underneath you. But and if you read the remainder of the chapter, it's a big but. It's basically you fell from grace. You didn't live up to what you're supposed to be, and it ends up coming down to like talking about being cast out and sent to Hades. All this type of imagery we get with the fall of the Watchers. So it's very interesting that when you actually put that text in context, the very passage that Cotton Mathers was quoted from this quote-unquote angel about him being great is actually warning of the dangers of pride, and it's actually a veiled description of a pagan deity, The chief deity of the Syrians was a deity named as Ashura. Okay, so that's probably who Ezekiel's talking about. It would have seemed like Mathers would have picked up on that, but apparently he didn't. Either way, Cotton Mathers does become a very prominent figure in the Christian church as a whole, particularly in the United States. Right, he's one of the most prominent Christian figures in the United States. Although his published works do become popular over in England, which is going to be significant for our next point, which is where I do want to pick up, and that is around the person of. Let me find my notes here. I got to be careful with my notes. On my last video, I don't normally take notes. I usually just go from memory. But the last video, I actually did write notes on there. I wrote the wrong date on. And I was reading the notes and I said the wrong date, and then I actually caught myself because my memory was better than my notes. But I'm going to still try to stay with the notes. We'll see how that goes. Okay, so I want to go to John Nelson Darby. Okay, so John Nelson Darby, he never, as far as we know, never like studied directly under Cotton Mathers. But like I said, Mathers was a really important figure. He was very influential. And why I wanted to bring up Mathers is not only because of the story about these angelic visions he has, which sort of spurn his interest in end times theology. It's Mathers is kind of considered the sort of like the grandfather of dispensationalism. He doesn't actually like create the theory and sort of the ideology of dispensationalism, but he starts using some of the terms that get adopted by people like Darby. So he's Mathers is widely considered the first person to really start using the word like rapture. I think he does use the word dispensation or dispensationalism. And again, a lot of this comes out of, again, his reinterpreting of the book of Revelation as being related to his own time as a Puritan minister in the colonies. Okay. But regardless of that, sometime later, this is now, we're in the 1820s. Okay. So Mathers had predicted the end of the world in 1716. But now we're jumping another century ahead. So we're in the 1800s. This man named John Nelson Darby, he's living in Ireland, okay? And he starts to sort of create an ideology which he uses to interpret the entire sort of scriptural narrative as a, sort of an eschatological movement, and ends up creating what we would call dispensational theology, okay? Which is where we get this idea of like, the 1,000 years and the rapture and the end times, what they're going to look like, heaven and hell, all these types of things that kind of get teased out. Now, he comes up with this sort of the primary articulation of dispensationalism in the years of 1927 to 1930. Okay, and that's when he apparently he was on a horse riding expedition and he got in a bad accident. Kind of reminds me of like Paul falling off the horse on the road to Damascus. And then from there, he started to develop this theory. Now, I don't know if the accident caused some type of injury that led to him not being able to work, or why the accident was related to it. But in the literature, it brings up he had this bad accident, and then he sort of started to focus on reading the scriptures, and he kind of came up with this new idea of dispensationalist. And I have noted here, he's introducing the ideas of like this sort of secret reading of the book of Revelation that does provide certain insights to those who are the people, the chosen, the ones interpreting it, not unlike everyone else we've kind of seen this far. But what's controversial? There's lots of things controversial about Darby. Some people, though, have argued that his entire theology of dispensationalism was actually stolen from a 15-year-old girl by the name of Margaret MacDonald. Now, Margaret MacDonald, 15-year-old girl living in Ireland as well, and she was known to be a prophetess, and she would have these visions and she'd predict these things. And in, lo and behold, 1830, she has this vision and claims a lot of this sort of end time theology. Same types of things, rapture, dispensation, stuff like that. And we do know that Darby did meet with her around this time. So if you match the time limits up of when he's sort of creating his dispensational theology and when he's actually meeting with this young girl, Margaret MacDonald, the timetables do match. And what Margaret MacDonald prophesies is in a lot of ways similar to what Darby will promote in dispensationalism. Now, skeptics like to argue that no, I mean, he did meet with her, but that doesn't mean that's where he got his ideas from. Maybe it may have sparked some ideas, but actually some of the things she said didn't end up equating the exact same thing that Darby concluded. Either way, it's a bizarre story, and it's another one of a person having a vision about end times and making predictions. Okay, and whether he was directly influenced or indirectly influenced by this prophetess, this young woman in Ireland, I guess it's a matter of debate. But either way, the timetable is the same. So it kind of brings us back to this example I gave in the first video, where Kenneth Grant was looking at the writings of Lovecraft and the writings of Crowley and finding correlations of a similar nature that seem to be coming from the astral realm. Maybe it could be argued the same thing's happening here in Ireland, where you have one young woman getting a prophecy about this, and then Darby himself seems to be writing out this theology. So dispensationalism, I've talked about it a lot. I have several videos on the book of Revelation in their entirety. I'm not going to go into it, but it does set the stage for what really does become a foundational principle of evangelicalism. So Darby is pretty much considered the father of dispensationalism. So if we think of like Cotton Mather's as kind of like the grandfather, like he's sort of setting the stage. Darby's the one who is the father of it. Like he really like gives birth to this idea. And there's a lot of different ideas in there. There's hidden spiritual signs such as the rapture, so on and so forth. It all relates to end time theology, like we talked about. But he creates a church. Within the Protestant, there's a lot of different divisions of the Protestant church. There's many different variations because they don't have a central, organized like papacy, like in Catholicism. So you have a lot of diversity here. He creates a church that's known as the Plymouth Brethren. Okay, and this is where he promotes his dispensational theology. Now, what makes this extra interesting, and I'm not making this up, it's just a little too crazy to believe, but one of the members or someone who I should say becomes a member of the Plymouth Brethren Church, started by John Nelson Darby, the creator of dispensationalism, is Aleister Crowley. Yeah, that Aleister Crowley. The same Aleister Crowley that's, the wickedest man in England, the guy on the cover of the Beatles album, the Beast 666 himself, right? The man who influences people like Antoine LaVey, who creates the Church of Satan, all of this, okay? Aleister Crowley was a member of the Plymouth Brethren. So hold on to that thought for a minute. Now, before I go too much down that rabbit hole, because Crowley does come later chronologically, I do want to jump back in to what's happening in America. Okay, so we've kind of looked over at England, or I should say Ireland, technically, with Darby. His thoughts, of course, do come to the colonies, or at this point, the states, because it's independent country. But there are other things going on that I think are relevant for our discussion as we move forward. So what were the dates I had for Darby? I'm sorry if I'm jumping around too much here. 1820s, 1830s, essentially, is when this comes about. So a new movement really starts to gain popularity in the United States at this time. And it's based off the writings of a woman. I believe she was Russian originally in origin. And her name is Madame Blavatsky. Okay. Madame Blavatsky ends up being a very, very prominent figure in the occult and specifically the New Age movement. Okay. Her books are probably hard to find at this point, which is a good thing because it's not particularly worth reading. It's very hard to sort of decipher and break down, but I'm going to give you kind of a sort of a summation of her. Essentially, she claimed that she had traveled to the East and she had gone to Tibet. And there she had this religious encounter and she studied under these Tibetan monks and she gained all this secret knowledge. She refers to a book that she pulled this from and that she actually creates principles from. And it's spelled, I think, Dzyam, but it's pronounced Dijon, like the mustard. And it's this, again, esoteric book that no one has ever been able to find or produce, but Blavatsky claimed it was real. So again, we're getting back to kind of like the Necronomicon and this sort of weird thing. So perhaps Blavatsky would claim it was, in the astral realm. I don't know. But either way, she said that there were essentially 7 Mahatmas who taught her all of this theory, and she builds it together to create what's called, I'm going to pull up her book here, Theosophy. Okay, so and she creates the Theosophical Society. I can't say that word for some reason. So too many weird letters. Theosophy, and essentially what Theosophy is is it's the effort to sort of take all these sort of religions throughout the world and unify them into one theory. So if you think of like the unified field theory and like physics, Blavatsky's kind of trying to do that in the esoteric sort of religious space, and she feels like she has it. What she really is doing is just introducing Western audiences to what we would call Eastern mysticism and a monistic system of thought. So I've talked before about how the West primarily operated out of a dualistic system that came from Platonic dualism. The East tends to look at a monistic model, which is sort of like everything flows from one thing and it's all flowing back together, which makes sense why when she looks at all the religions of the world, they all are essentially for her the same thing. They're all talking about the same thing. It's all this sort of oneness. Now, why Blavatsky is so important is lots of reasons, but she's just on a pop culture level, she's the person who kind of popularized so many of the Eastern concepts that we find here in the West. So everything from like karma to meditation and yoga and chakras and the yin and the yang and all kinds of different Buddhist philosophies. She didn't invent those, obviously, but her theosophy theosophy I can't say the word. I'm sorry. Some words I just can't say is her theory is basically it popularized a lot of those ideas. I mean, people in the West knew of them, but they weren't like popular on a mainstream level. So it sort of became a very mainstream idea. But it really sort of bursts in a lot of ways what becomes the New Age movement. Because like all of these people, what she gathers from this, encounter she has with this text, the Dijon, and these mystical sages. By the way, there's 7 of them. And in theosophy, there's always 7. She uses this number 7, which we're going to see again. This gets back to this idea of, in the occult, how numbers are really important and they get really into like numerology and stuff. But she writes this book. It's a massive work. It's actually this is a collection of 2 volumes. It's called The Secret Doctrine. And again, right there right off the top, you hear this, the idea of secret, right? So it's like hidden knowledge, right? Going all the way back to Genesis 6 and all the occult practices, right? Occult means, hidden knowledge. It means secret knowledge. So this is called The Secret Doctrine. And it's, this massive collection of ideas. And she tries to pull from all over the place and kind of bring it together and claim it's all sort of uniquely connected in this weird synergistic way. So it's called the synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy. And that's what she's claiming to do. She's claiming that she's bringing all of these major sort of what we can consider like, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, yeah, just like our main Western ideas, our sciences and ideas, so philosophy, science, and religion, into one sort of systematic thought. Now, why she's relevant, other than all the reasons I've already discussed, is another thing that's really also bizarre. And this is where I'm going to pull up my whiteboard here, because you're not going to be able to see it on the camera. But on the side of this book, you can't see it very well. You have the emblem or the symbol of the Theosophy or Theosophical Society. Okay, and this is the emblem that she made. And of course, true to form, it's made up of 7 other symbols. Okay, and each of these are symbols that she's pulled from other traditions, getting back to her idea that the secret doctrine is a synthesis of all these different things. Okay, now I want to just briefly show you these because it is going to be relevant to some points I'm going to make down the road. So just bear with me. There is a method to my madness, so I apologize if this all seems all over the place. So the first symbol that we get in the symbol that she has, I'm going to just sort of draw it here. Okay, it actually is a Hindu symbol. It's called the Om. Okay, and it looks, I'm probably not going to have it perfectly here, but it looks essentially something like this. This is called the Om, and it comes from Hinduism. Okay, so this is the first symbol that you get in her theosophical emblem. Okay, now there's a second symbol. Okay, and you can look this up online and see yourself, but I'm just going to show you. And it's basically a serpent. This is one you've probably seen before. It's in a circle, and essentially the head of the serpent is eating its own tail. Okay, mine's a little bit off-centered, but it looks sort of like this. And this is called the, spell it right, Aurora Boreas. Okay, this is something that comes out of Egyptian, and Gnostic thought. Okay, we've talked about the Gnostics. Okay, so here's kind of what that looks like over here. I'm sorry, I don't know the ring light's going to kind of be, but you get an idea what it looks like. Okay, so that comes from Egypt. Just combining that. I'm going to skip that one because it's the one I want to point out. It's the end one, but there's some other ones. She then has the six-sided star. Now that comes from Judaism, right? In the Star of David, but in the occult, it also relates to King Solomon. Now in the occult, they claim that King Solomon did all kinds of occult things. There's actually some books called the Keys of Solomon, the Major and Minor Keys of Solomon. They were not written by Solomon. They're written much later. But what they do is they look at the combination of these two triangles, which makes your six-pointed star, and these are representational of different things within the occult, notably what is up, okay, which would be like, I think air and fire, if I remember correctly, and what is down, which is waters and earth. And it also gets back to the hermetical statement of what is above is so below, which is a very occult statement. So Blavatsky kind of takes the Star of David and its six-pointed star and breaks it into these two separate triangles, and then pulls this from, she claims, Solomon, but it's really just utilizing these two triangular shapes to represent the sort of pagan cultic idea that comes from Hermeticism, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So that comes from, I guess you could say, the Jewish/Christian tradition. I use in scare quotes. And then she has, of course, the Ankh, which also comes out of Egypt. And it's sort of a circle on the top, and then it's sort of like a line like this. A-N-K-H, okay? So there's this one. So that's the sixth symbol. Now here's the seventh symbol, though. This is where this gets real wacky. And I don't have time to go into all the details of how wacky Blavatsky is, but this should give you at least a clue. I hope I'm doing it right. I think I am. The fact that I don't know how to do it right is probably a good thing. The center symbol that you find in her work is a swastika. Why does Blavatsky have a swastika in the center of her theosophical symbol? Well, Blavatsky claimed, based off her encounter with these sages, these Mahatmas, whatever you want to call them, in the reading of this mysterious book, the Dajan, that there were many ages that came before. Of course, there's going to be 7 total ages. Everything comes down to 7. Several of those ages have already transpired, okay? So the first is the Polarian race, or the root race, and these are giant beings who are pure astrological energy. Okay, this is per her. The second are the Hyperborean, which are semi-ethereal and have some form, but are still largely spirit beings, and also still large, like giants. The third are called the Lemurian, which are the first of these entities to take on some type of physical form. And this is all according to her, whatever. But here's where it gets real fun and wild. The fifth is known as the Atlanteans, as in the people of Atlantis, okay, which is a very occult idea that's widely popular throughout a lot of occult literature. And these are known as builders, okay, builders of city, and they have a fall from a cataclysm. Okay, this is what she claims. But this leads us to the fifth, who are the Aryans, okay? And they are rational and intellectual, and they are essentially the human beings of the highest order who came after the Atlanteans, and they are the ones who sort of set the stage for this world in the wake of the cataclysms that the Atlanteans experienced. And then from there, there's the future stages where the goal is, and this would be in stages 6 and 7. Presumably, we were, I guess, in stage 6. I may be misspoken, but just going off this, I'm assuming that, because ultimately the goal would be to get to stage 7, which is fully returning to our spiritual form. So it's like a full circle. Hence the Aurora Boreas. Okay, where it's everything comes back to one. So it's sort of a monistic model. But why this is so important to my points is this is where Heimlich Himmler and the Nazis get their philosophy. They get it from Blavatsky. They were all huge fans of Blavatsky. And this is why they start combing the globe, looking for not only ancient artifacts, they're actually looking for the swastika symbol because it is an old symbol and it has shown up in a lot of different places, including places like Tibet and I think some places in India. So we knew it was a really old symbol. We didn't know what it means or why it was there, but Blavatsky claims it was the symbol of the Aryans. Hence why it's adopted by the Nazis. So the Nazis go to Tibet. The Nazis go to Antarctica because Blavatsky claims that all this stuff can be found in these really remote regions, and they believe this stuff. Now Blavatsky and people who still adhere to maybe her thinking would probably be quick to say, well, she wasn't trying to encourage racism and the genocide of people, but what she was looking for is the coming of a new age, and sort of in a sort of a Nietzschean sense, right, of man sort of becoming the Übermensch and evolving to a higher level. And what the Nazis believed was that when they believed they were the descendants of the Aryans, so they believed that they were called to essentially propagate this in the same way that all these other people, thought this. So whether it's in the Christian space, the sort of evangelical space, and by the way, I'm not talking about like the teachings of Jesus as in the Bible. I'm talking about a very specific group of people who were promoting a certain problematic ideology. So when I say Christian, I have to be careful because I'm not talking about all Christians, and I'm certainly not talking about the Christian religion. I'm talking about a specific Christian tradition that becomes evangelicalism, okay? But they're all promoting these ideas, and much in the same way that I was talking about sort of the astral realm, it seems these ideas were there, they're manifesting in different ways, right? So in this case, it's being some type of monistic philosophy that gets adopted by Nazis, and they believe that they're the chosen ones who have to propagate and bring in the new era. In fact, that's what the Third Reich is. Third Reich means the third reign. And they believe that they're moving into the third reign. And that comes from this same type of dispensationalist model that's linked to the book of Revelation and this claim that there will be a new era and that the world will end as we know it. Now, again, what that looks like for them varies. They believed it would be evolving into a new age, right, of a higher order versus, Jerusalem, coming to earth and God restoring his creation, which is what the book actually says. But this is where all these ideas come from. If that's not crazy enough, it gets crazier because these ideas get picked up even further. Sorry, I'm just making sure. I don't think I need these notes anymore. All these ideas get picked up. And so there starts to emerge a lot of different secret societies. We already had things like Freemasonry and the Rosicrucians coming out of Europe, excuse me. But England, there's a society that gets formed that's based off a lot of the teachings of Blavatsky. It certainly incorporates a ton of the teachings and ideas out of Freemasonry, but it also it takes on just sort of general Western Gnosticism. So it's again kind of like Blavatsky. It's pulling from a lot of different places, and it calls itself the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Now, Hermetic comes from the term Hermes, which is based off a very occult figure who may or may not have been real, probably not. But they call him Hermes Trismegistus, which means, or Trismegistus, depending on how you want to say it, which means thrice great. And he was supposedly this sage that had all this knowledge, and he sort of wrote all these books that had gotten lost, like the Necronomicon and the Dijon, so no one can find them. But it's basically just Neoplatonism. I'm just going to throw that out there. And again, people who are into this, they'll probably get mad, but that's all you're doing. It's just Neoplatonism. But anyways, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn becomes a very popular elite society, especially among academics living in England. Okay, so this is in 1887 to 1903 where it's very prevalent. And one of the chief members of this is Aleister Crowley. Okay, so after Aleister Crowley leaves his upbringing at the Plymouth Brethren Church under John Nelson Darby, he goes to school. I think he went to Oxford. And there he meets up with other intellectuals and he joins into this Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And it's made up of all kinds of elites and famous people. In the same way that so many early Americans and founding fathers are linked back to Freemasonry, a lot of your top sort of academic writers, poets, all that out of England in this era are connected and affiliated with the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. But Crowley ends up being the most infamous of them for many reasons. Okay. Now let's go back from the occult into the Christian space, because some other really important things happen. We talked about Darby essentially creating the Plymouth Brethren and dispensational theology. But where this really gains full headway, especially in the States, is, and I'll grab my Bible here, because this is an actual copy of one of these. In 1909, a man by the name of Cyrus Scofield, who I've talked about before and has a little bit of a scattered and strange past himself, he becomes a ardent a student of Darby and of his dispensational theology. And he decides to create a reference Bible. Okay. And what the reference Bible is it's the Bible, but then he footnotes all these different ideas. And essentially, the footnotes he's creating are generated in order to promote and read into certain passages dispensational theology. And why this is so significant is because this ends up becoming the most popular Bible in the United States. And it becomes the Bible that pretty much everyone in the early 1900s was reading. And so they have this reference Bible that they're looking for. And like any normal person, when they go to read a passage, they want to help make sense of it, or they try to read a book like Revelation, which is potentially confusing if you don't know its historical context, they get all this dispensational theology. And now this becomes fully inculcated into essentially the mainline Protestant Christian religions of America. And particularly, it becomes a foundational principle to what becomes known as fundamentalism, and essentially then subsequently evangelicalism. And it's all because of this Bible. Okay, I talked about the Necronomicon being one of the greatest hoaxes of the 20th century in the occult. Well, the Scofield Reference Bible is probably the greatest hoax ever pulled in the 20th century in the Christian space. So those are equally problematic texts that have created all kinds of troubles that are coming from ideas that are certainly not scriptural. Okay. But the Bible becomes very popular, and Cyrus Scofield promotes it and it sells. And then this is sort of why dispensational theology becomes so significant and prevalent in the United States of America. Okay. Now, if we go back to England, where people like Aleister Crowley are living, this is the time now where he's having his visions. Okay. He's in Egypt with, I think, his wife in Cairo, and he has his first vision. He starts interacting with beings that he thinks are there to help him. One of them's name is Awas. He also comes in contact with Corazon, who's the same entity that John Dee and Edward Kelly claim to have encountered. And Crowley views himself similar to the Nazis, even though he hated the Nazis, which is weird in its own way. They were like similar but different, just enough that they hated each other. But Crowley sees himself as being this sort of, again, person put in a position where he's ushering in this new era, this new age. It's like the dawning of Aquarius. It's like the new astrological age that's going to be coming, and it's going to mean this evolution of, new thought. And so he sees himself as that person. In the same way that the Nazis rationalized the destruction of the Jews and others, because they believe, well, they'll be reincarnated. This is what they believe. They believe by killing the Jews, it was fine because they're going to be reincarnated as Aryans. Okay. Crowley believed that by essentially ushering in the apocalypse, by being the beast, essentially, which is what he called himself, he's essentially actually just birthing a new era when we will no longer be tied to our sort of moral laws that served a purpose in the old world. But now that we had evolved to such a level, we no longer needed to abide by these laws. And there's a very specific practice that he goes into. He gets into and creates what's called sex magic, which sounds interesting. But it shouldn't be surprising that Crowley was heavily influenced by John Dee and Edward Kelly. In fact, he believed he was continuing their Enochian magic. Much of those Enochian principles, including the Enochian towers, the four watchtowers, get directly adopted into the Hermetic order of the Golden Dawn. And Crowley is essentially trying to continue that same project that Dee and Edwards did in terms of bringing in the apocalypse and sort of ushering in this new age. He starts having his own visions. He's in Egypt, so he creates the Thelema or Thelematic order, which is an Egyptian-based sort of mythology. It's a religion based somewhat on Egyptian mythology, because a lot of these visions he's had are Egyptian in nature, and that's where he was when he had them. But it's basically set on the premise of do as thou wilt, okay, which means that do what you want to do, basically, like you're your own god. And that idea also ends up influencing people like Antoine LaVey, who creates the Church of Satan. Okay, so some really heinous, dark stuff there. But if you read Crowley's work, and I'm not recommending you do, but most of it's unintelligible because it's almost just like him recording his visions. It's sort of reminiscent if you've ever read or seen a person who's in hypnotic regression. Okay, it's very much like that, which again, makes sense because I do believe hypnotic regression is essentially doing the same thing. You're just tapping into something. And they're sending you into an altered state of consciousness. So it's sort of like this altered state of consciousness where he's writing things down, and these become like considered sort of sacred texts and like the Thelematic order, because Crowley is this special being that they look up to. It's all kind of, in my opinion, just crazy, but it does have incredible impact. And in his fictional writings, because Crowley was a poet and he did write novels, you get his ideology, but in a way that's maybe a little bit more digestible, if I can use that. And I use that very, very loosely. But his novel Moonchild it's hilarious because it's not even truthfully fiction. Every character in the book is based off a real person. So he's basically just like telling the story of like real people, but pretending it's like fiction, and then sells it as a fictional novel. And it's probably for that reason that's maybe the best actual piece of literary material he ever wrote. But it's essentially talking about these group of sort of magicians, living in England, and the one, chief protagonist, he's essentially trying to find this woman to procreate with, and use his sort of sex magic to birth in what he calls the moon child. And the moon child is going to be like, that thing, the Antichrist or whatever you want to call it, that sort of brings in the new era. Okay, and there's various different ways you could interpret that. We don't need to do that. Long story short, it all comes down to this idea of sex even being a way of garnishing power and harnessing power and allowing a person to have access to the spirit world, and then subsequently essentially creating a demonic born child to carry on this tradition. Now, again, that's probably not how Crowley would explain it, but that's certainly what's happening. So that's really important and interesting, maybe or maybe not, because we have to go back to the United States again and talk briefly about, because we're already at 38 minutes, Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard. And if things weren't already crazy enough, they're about to get real crazy. So Jack Parsons, the rocket scientist who got rockets to the moon and is credited for that, in fact, he has a crater on the moon named after him, was also a huge occultist. And he was a student of Crowley. And he, like Crowley, felt like he was called to usher in this new era of whatever, okay, the new age. So he also picked up where Crowley left off and Dee left off, and he started doing what's called the Babylon workings. And it's the same thing. It's like a scrying session that he's documenting and recording. He was working with another person, okay? So in the same way that John Dee was working with Edward Kelly, and John Dee was kind of the person performing the spell work, and then Kelly was the person actually having the visions and scrying. The same format exists with Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard. Yes, that L. Ron Hubbard, the Scientology guy. Okay, I'm not making this up. Hubbard starts doing scrying sessions for Jack Parsons, and they also start having visions. They also start predicting the end times and the ushering in of this age. And he also continues Crowley's sex magic, where he seeks out this scarlet woman, okay, that he's supposed to find and procreate with in order to bring in this new era. And the way that they believe this would happen, by the way, is that we're going to essentially open a portal in the spirit world to allow these spiritual entities back in. Okay. which is interesting for a lot of reasons. Because after these things happen, certainly, say what you will, a lot of weird things start happening, right? Crowley is basically working right as we go into World War II or World War One, excuse me, and then Parsons like in World War II, and then subsequently, this is also when we start having UFO sightings and stuff. So people are trying to correlate these events, but either way, Parsons ends up dying, performing a ritual. Some people think he was killed or knocked off because he was too much of a threat. He had too much knowledge. Maybe it was a government knockoff. Some people think he just blew himself up in his own garage doing experiments. Who knows? But what's weird about this, but that's not already covered, is that his story and L. Ron Hubbard's story eerily match the story of John Dee and Edward Kelly, because what happens is, I'm not making this up, L. Ron Hubbard ends up having a sexual affair openly, because again, sex magic, with Jack Parsons' wife, and ends up running off with her and taking all her money. Exactly what John Dee did to, or sorry, exactly what Edward Kelly did to John Dee. In case of L. Ron Hubbard, he moves to Miami, and he starts a yacht company, and then eventually creates Scientology, and also several other different. He's involved in a lot of other different sort of bizarre occult religious practices, including the process, which is the thing that um, Manson was involved with. Okay, so a lot of just weird stuff here, people. But all this gets back to this tradition of the occult. Okay, now, just to close off on some of these ideas, because I do want to have a kind of wrap this all up, and what's the point of all this, Brad? I just do want to make out a couple other points. So the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn does eventually split apart because there's disagreements. So again, we get back to Crowley's Moonchild novel and how there's sort of like all these like uh, fighting factions, even within this sort of occult sort of um, world of magic. There's these different people. So they split into to four different groups. One of them becomes known as the Independent Rectified Rite. This tended to attract people who are more mystics, and it ends up being led by A.E. Waite. Okay, that's a name you probably have heard before. Okay, Waite is portrayed in a fictional way in Crowley's Moonchild, but Waite is the person who not only wrote a lot of occult texts, but he's actually responsible for creating the Waite Rider Tarot deck, which is the most popular tarot deck, okay, that people use when they're doing tarot readings. So that comes from A.E. Waite. So he was in the Golden Dawn. He starts his own faction. Then there was what's called the Stella Matutina. I'm probably saying that wrong, or the Magical Traditionalists is how they're usually qualified. So the Stella Matutina. Some of these are foreign words, so again, I'm probably botching, and I apologize. But this ends up being led by W.B. Yeats, the poet and literary writer, very famous Yeats. You've heard of Yeats before. So he was heading this order, okay? Then there's what's called the Alpha et Omega. These people were the people, they kind of call them loyalists. These are the people who followed Samuel Mathers. And Samuel Mathers was the person who was previously in charge of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And he's someone that apparently Crowley did not get along with, which is why Crowley also left and created his own Thelema structure of magic. So that becomes Aleister Crowley. He creates Thelema around 1904. And we've talked about that. But why this is all also sort of interesting is if we go back to, and this is, again, I apologize, this is dark, but it's true. If we go back to the Christian tradition that's become widely popular throughout the states, that's largely anchored in a lot of this dispensational theology. You have several other things happen. There's a group of people that a lot of people who grew up in the Christian church like to pull from as examples. For Protestants and especially people in the evangelical space, they like to refer to C.S. Lewis, right? The great academic writer. He wrote fiction, but he also wrote a lot of apologetic theological writings. The Catholics often pull from J.R.R. Tolkien, right? The writer of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, because both of these men were professed Christians. Again, Tolkien was Catholic, Lewis was Protestant, but there was this group of them called the Inklings, okay, and they would hang out together and they would talk. Lewis was originally an agnostic or an atheist, but he ended up becoming a Christian, which is that's very public and very known. And so people tend to look at them because they're the two most famous members of the Inklings. Now, the Inklings wasn't a big group. It was literally just a small group of friends, and they would go to like a pub and they would drink and they would smoke. But because smoke pipes, by the way, because or cigars. Marijuana wasn't popular, although who knows what Crowley was doing. Um, so Tolkien and Lewis are hanging out with their friends. Now, what a lot of people don't know is the third most prominent member of the Inklings is actually a man by the name of Charles Williams. Okay, and why that's so interesting is that Charles Williams was a member of the Fellowship of the Rosy Cross, okay, which was an occult um, group, and that was from 1917 to 1927. And then he eventually becomes the master of the temple. Okay, and this is another one of the offshoots of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. So this is strange because you have, to me, and take it as you will. You have C.S. Lewis writing books like the Chronicles of Narnia, where he's dealing with this other world, this through the wardrobe, and he's dealing with like the witch, the White Witch, and he's creating certainly a very clear correlation, allegory for the scriptures, the Bible. But then, of course, Tolkien, right? He's writing about Middle Earth and wizards and elves and all these different things. And meanwhile, they're hanging out with Charles Williams, their best friend, who is an occultist, deeply involved, in fact, a master of the temple of one of the offsprings of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, of Aleister Crowley and A.E. Waite. And you can't make this stuff up, people. Okay, you can't make it up. It's just too weird. Um, by the time you get into 1970s, this is when Kenneth Grant comes along. He starts writing his Typhon trilogy. I'm not going to go into that at depth. I already talked about that. He's the one who links the writings of Lovecraft with the writings of Aleister Crowley. But in the Christian space, from the same time, you have Hal Lindsey publish his Late Great Planet Earth book, which sells millions of copies. And basically, in that text, Lindsey claims that he is interpreting the signs of the times and that he's looking around at the world and he sees that the end times have arrived and that it's only a matter of time before all the things that he perceives to be the book of Revelation to be about, which he's wrong, but will manifest. And the end times will occur and there's going to be the rapture and all this kind of stuff. Okay, and that was in the 1970s, and it sort of creates this sort of hysteria and this rapture scare. And there's a lot of people who sort of it's like a Jesus movement that comes like post hippie movement, and it's a whole thing. But it was a very popular book, and then it ends up kind of being the inspiration in the 90s for like the Left Behind series, which also was widely popular in evangelical circles. But again, all of this comes back to the same line of thought of being able to interpret things as though it's secret knowledge and having secret insights. Perhaps what's most significant about Lindsey's work is he directly connects it to the emergence of Israel as a nation. Okay, so this becomes a common theme in this same space where this idea is, well, Israel is going to be a nation again. I should have looked up the actual date that happened because I'm not sure where that falls chronologically. But this is an idea that is prevalent, and so it's this idea. Well, now we know that we're in the end times because in the book of Revelation it talks about the nation of Israel, and it's not had a nation state for so long. And so this is why so many people professing Christianity in the evangelical space are so quick to want to, preserve Israel because they think that that's a piece in this greater puzzle. Okay. And again, it goes all the way back to Edward Kelly and John Dee, who claimed in their scrying sessions with these demonic entities that, the Americas were going to be this new Jerusalem. Okay. And even Columbus was looking for a way back into the Middle East to recapture the actual Jerusalem. Okay. And it's all based off this same series of ideological thoughts, and they're just manifesting in different ways. And some of it's being manifest in the Christian space, and some of it's being manifest in the occult space, but it's really the same ideas. And they're all heavily tied together in a weird way that probably most people don't even realize. Now, what is the point of all this? Why am I having this conversation? I do have good intents. I'm not doing this because I'm just trying to dump on the Christian tradition in evangelical churches and things like that. That's not my goal. One is I think it needs to be exposed. It needs to be shown. And there's a lot more I could say, but I'm already at 50 minutes, and I do want to have some just sort of concluding thoughts to hopefully tie this together. Firstly, I've covered in depth in my other videos that the book of Revelation, especially the first 19 chapters, I believe it's 19 chapters, might be, yeah, I think it's 19. The last 3 chapters are such like an epilogue. It's most definitely a detailed account in a allegorical form, in a prophetic way, written in a prophetic way, like the traditions in the past, like Isaiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, etc., about the war between the Romans and the Jews. And all of that transpires in the first century. Meaning all of that imagery that's in Revelation that's being picked up by Darby and Crowley and Mathers and John Dee, all of that is imagery that's specifically relating to actual historical events that happened long ago. Okay. Now, it does say at the end that Christ will return, and there will be a second coming, and there will be also what's called a second resurrection. Okay. I'm not going to go too deep into that because I probably need to create an entire video just about the idea of heaven and hell as it tends to exist at a popular level in the evangelical space, and how that's actually not scriptural either. It comes from Platonism, okay? But I don't have time for that today. But all of this comes from this. And I say this because here's something I've noticed personally in my own life when I interact with young people or people my own age. First of all, I've seen a lot of them walk away from the church, okay? And most of them grew up in an evangelical church, in an evangelical home. Most of them had great families and things like that, and they were very well loved. But as they got older, they started to find that a lot of the teachings that they were getting were problematic. And that's correct, as I've shown. And so what's happened is a lot of people have associated that particular ideological perspective with what Christianity is. And I don't think that that's correct. And when I talk to people who either rejected their Christian values or concurrently reject the Christian religion for any number of reasons, they give a long list of things of why they are opposed to Christianity. And it's everything from it's a colonialist religion. It was imperialistic. It's grounded in racism. It's all about judgment, and it's not about love. It tends to be hypocritical. It's internally inconsistent. All these types of things, which are correct if you adhere to that evangelical belief structure. But when you put it in the context of all this occult stuff, what you actually realize is the colonialization, okay, of the colonies, that came directly from the occult. Like that was John Dee's idea. He's the one who put that in Queen Elizabeth's ear. That's why she sent Captain Drake to the States. The idea that it was going to be a new Jerusalem, that's coming from John Dee, an occultist. Okay, that's a cult. That's not what the Bible says. Okay, there's nothing about that in the Bible. Okay, this idea of the end times and ushering in these new era, this new age, that's a new age thought. That comes from everything from John Dee. It comes from Blavatsky. Even Crowley is promoting that, which makes sense why he grew up in the Plymouth Brethren Church, which was the church created by John Nelson Darby, the father of dispensationalism. Okay, it's all there. Okay, now what's bizarre also, or perhaps ironic, is this in this whole situation. So many of these young people I talk to who have rejected Christianity because of all these reasons are actually turning to alternate forms of spirituality. They're getting into things like the occult. They're getting into things like astrology. They're getting into things like Wicca or witchcraft. Okay, they're getting into Eastern mysticism. You wouldn't believe the number of people I meet who are into various forms of Eastern mysticism, and they're all about meditating and sort of achieving higher levels of consciousness and tuning into certain chakras. These things have just become standards now here in the States. I don't know about in other countries, but people regularly go get like acupuncture done, and they're doing and all this kind of stuff. Okay, and it's just become this sort of alternate form of spiritualism. Okay, the problem with that is, and this is where it's ironic, all those things that they didn't like, racism. Okay, we talked about that. Blavatsky, right? The Aryan culture. That's what Nazis used. Okay, they were pulling from Blavatsky. Okay, the Nazis. This is the woman, Madame Blavatsky, who's essentially the queen of the New Age movement, is the one with the swastika on her book, people. Okay, like I'm not making this up. Okay, and when you talk about Eastern mysticism, that's what she was bringing. The Dijon, this mysterious book that she had that was creating this higher order and this monistic model, that's all Blavatsky. Okay, the stuff that they're really concerned about, they should be concerned about, but they're viewing that as being Christian, not as pagan, not as occult. They view the occult as being very accepting and very loving, and it's just about getting back to nature, and they don't know the history of all this stuff and how dark it really is. And then they get into it, and then before they know it, they're in maybe too deep, and they've got problems. Okay, and then they look at Christianity and they see it as a flawed or failed system, but that's only because they're interpreting it through this evangelical lens. So I apologize in advance if I've offended anyone who's a member of the evangelical church or who still adamantly promotes dispensational theology. Um, I'm not trying to upset people, but I am trying to speak what I believe the truth is. And I'm also trying to expose what I think to be a very, very big problem. And I think that this is why so many people have an adverse reaction to modern Christianity as it has manifest really over the last 100 years here in the United States. Hopefully you found that helpful and interesting. There's so much more I could say, but I've already went on too long. There's even people I didn't even bring up and mention because I just, you know what, it's like at this point, let's hit the big points because this is already a second video. I don't need to say more, but hopefully you found this interesting. And if so, share it with people, talk about it. Don't ever take anything I say as fact. Go do your own research. Maybe you come to different opinions, and if so, bring them up. I'm always open to a dialogue. I myself am always learning. But yeah, this is what I'm seeing, and I pretty well walked you through it. So it's kind of hard to deny, in my opinion. All right, have a good day.